What if everything you learned about faith was built on fear? For almost 20 years, a woman believed this object was her only bridge to God. Every bead, a promise. Every prayer, a step closer to heaven. Until the day she saw it used as a weapon. And in that instant, with a clarity that chilled her soul, she realized she had been praying to silence. Before we dive into this journey, if you connect with stories of transformation, take this moment to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments below what city or country you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Prepare yourself for an intimate account of breaking chains, the courage to doubt, and the discovery that true freedom is sometimes born from a single forbidden question. Let's begin. My name is Hanin Aguilar. I am 39 years old, and I was born in Iraq, in the heart of Guanajuato. I am writing this today because I need to release something that shaped me for almost 2 decades and then shattered in a single instant. For most of my life, I believed with blind devotion that salvation was a matter of insistence, spiritual mathematics, where each Hail Mary prayed was one more rung on the ladder to heaven. I felt the rosary's weight at my waist as a blacksmith feels the weight of his hammer. It was my tool, my protection, the guarantee that God was listening. I believed this because it was what I was taught. Within the walls where I grew up, doubt was not an option. But then one day I saw something. It wasn't a vision from heaven. It wasn't an angel. It was something painfully human. And in that moment, with terrifying clarity, I knew I had been praying to silence. A deaf, empty, indifferent silence. It all began not with divine calling, but with absence. My parents died in an accident when I was just 9 years old. My great aunt, a woman of rigid and unshakable faith, decided that the convent of the Sisters of Perpetual Contemplation was the best place for a girl with no clear future. The convent sat atop a hill, surrounded by cypress trees that always seemed to mourn beneath the sky. The thick stone walls carried a silence that smelled of wax and loneliness. Life inside was a cycle of whispered rules and endless prayers. We woke at 5 in the morning, prayed, worked, studied, and prayed again. Voices remained low, footsteps slow. Any louder sound seemed as if it might offend God. It was there they gave me my first dark wooden rosary, calling it my shield. I clung to it for years, like a drowning person clings to driftwood. The choice to remain and become Sister Hanin was not really a decision. It was more like a river sweeping me to the only destination that seemed possible. They said I had a vocation, that my spirit was contemplative by nature. The truth, which I barely admitted even to myself, was that the world outside terrified me. I didn't want to relive the abandonment my parents' death had left me with, so I clung to the promise of divine love, an eternal Father who would never leave. The first weeks in the novitiate blurred into a mix of fervor and bone-deep exhaustion. Everything was sacred, scrubbing stone floors until they shone, fasting in silence, copying ancient texts with aching hands. I felt part of something immense. Mother Susan, our superior, had a voice soft as velvet but sharp as steel when needed. She often reminded us, "She who prays without ceasing will be heard without delay." And so we prayed. We prayed until the words lost meaning, dissolving into sound, a cadence that filled the emptiness of silence and my thoughts. The rosary was the pillar of our lives, not as nourishment but as command. It was obligatory, almost military. 3 times a day without fail, control was absolute. If you lost count, if you skipped a Hail Mary through sleep or distraction, you had to start over aloud, so your failure would be public. If anyone dared yawn during communal prayer, penance followed immediately. I saw novices, girls my age, kneel for hours on cold stone floors, eyes swollen with tears, clutching crucifixes as their lips trembled, whispering the same words over and over. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners." That was not faith. I felt it in my bones, even if I never named it aloud. It was punishment, fear dressed as devotion, and I for a long time never dared question. To think I knew better than the rules was to step into sin. I lived like this for 7 years, obedient and devout, or at least appearing so. Doubt was like opening the door to the devil. Thinking for myself was letting the enemy in. But cracks appeared in the routine. My heart tried to breathe. Often it happened early in the mornings when it was my turn to clean the chapel. In that stillness before the sun, incense lingering, and the only light the small flame of the sanctuary lamp, I would pause before the altar. I looked at the crucifix, at Mary's image, and a whisper crept in. Does God really hear me, or do my words just bounce back to me? It wasn't anger that frightened me, it was sadness. A realization that perhaps my prayers were monologues, endless repetitions, God neither asked for nor wanted. The confirmation of this fear came painfully clear. I remember vividly Sister Amanda, a solemn novice who hardly spoke, as though she feared the sound of her own voice. During afternoon prayer, weary, she lost count of the Hail Marys. Just a tiny mistake. Mother Susan did not shout. Her correction was cold, sharp like a knife. You will repeat the entire rosary again. On your knees, alone. Later I went to fetch cloths from the sacristy and passed by the half-open chapel door. The scene etched itself into me forever. Amanda knelt there in the darkness, trembling. Tears slid down her cheeks onto the stone floor. Her broken voice barely formed the words, and in that instant, an overwhelming certainty struck me. A truth I could no longer ignore. That was not faith. It was punishment. It was cruelty disguised as piety. And I knew deep in my bones that the God I sought could not want that. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in my cell, a cold and austere cubicle, with my eyes fixed on the dark wooden crucifix hanging on the wall. The image of Amanda trembling and whispering broken words was etched in my mind and gave me no peace. For the first time, I didn't look at the cross seeking solace, but with a question that burned within me. Did God, the merciful Father we heard so much about, really need so many repetitions to forgive a fault? Did he demand a display of suffering to be convinced of our faith? I thought of Jesus, of the stories in the Gospels we read. I thought of how he spoke simply to the poor, how he healed the sick with a touch, how he forgave with a single word. I tried to imagine him at any point in his life, counting Hail Marys on a string of beads just to feel closer to the Father. The image was absurd, almost laughable, and yet so empty that a shiver ran down my spine. In that silence, lying on the hard bed, I began to sense that we had traded the God of the Gospels for a God of rules and rituals. The silence of the convent, once sacred in my mind, took on another meaning after that night. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against the soul. A silence built from fear, fear of speaking freely, fear of feeling something forbidden, fear of asking the wrong question. To survive, I split myself in two. On the outside, I remained Sister Hanin, obedient, fervent, lips always moving at the exact rhythm of the prayers. Inside, however, I created a small hidden room. In that secret place, I kept my questions. They weren't heresies. Not yet, they were whispers. Doubts dripping like water onto stone, small but persistent. Why does silent sorrow for not understanding faith move me away from God, but mindlessly repeating prayers supposedly brings me closer to Him? The rosary hanging at my waist began to weigh differently. No longer a symbol of devotion, it felt like a chain, the visible link tying me to a performance I could no longer believe in. The hollow echo left in my heart after each repetition grew unbearable. Those questions stored in my secret room needed to escape, or I feared they would destroy me from the inside. That's when I began to write. While cleaning the small library, I managed to slip away with a soft-cover notebook and a stub of pencil. I hid it under the straw of my mattress. The secrecy terrified me as much as it relieved me. Every night after the silence bell rang, I lit a forbidden candle and wrote. Not heresies, but something perhaps more dangerous. Honest thoughts, words like fear, silence, emptiness, questions about punishment and forgiveness. I didn't confide in anyone, not even in God. My prayers had become formal, distant, like letters dropped into a mailbox that had no door. Letters you never knew reached a reader, or whether a reader even existed. One early morning, walking down the corridor that connected the cells to the chapel, I heard a sound that didn't belong to the sacred silence. It was a whisper, but not calm. It was choked, desperate. It came from the small oratory, a room almost never used. The heavy wooden door was ajar, a sliver of shadow cutting across the hallway. My first instinct was to keep walking. Meddling was a sin, but something, an impulse beyond my will, made me stop. I pushed the door with my fingertips, noiselessly. And there she was, Sister Mariana, kneeling alone in the half-dark. Her hands didn't rest in peaceful prayer. They clutched her rosary so tightly her knuckles turned white, as if the beads were the only thing holding her together. Her back shook beneath her habit. Her voice was barely audible, a broken thread repeating endlessly, "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners." I don't know if she didn't see me, or if she chose not to, but I froze. The candlelight threw her shadow high on the wall, a trembling, distorted figure, larger and far more terrifying than the fragile woman before me. I wanted to run. I wanted to kneel beside her. I wanted to scream, yet my body obeyed none of these urges. The only sound was her broken whisper, punctuated by my own ragged breath. I stepped back slowly, careful not to disturb the scene. Then another step. Then I closed the door. The soft click of the latch echoed like thunder in my ears. Back in my cell, I shivered, not from the night's chill, but from within. The next morning at breakfast, silence reigned. No one spoke of Mariana. No one even hinted. It was as if the night before had been erased. That's when I understood one of the convent's cruelest rules. When something hurt too much, when something grew unbearable, it wasn't discussed. It was buried beneath prayers. Suffering was swallowed by routine. Later that day, Mother Susan gathered us for the morning reading. Her voice was calm, steady, almost soothing, yet her words cut deep. She didn't name Mariana, but she didn't have to. "A sister who succumbs to vanity," she said, scanning our faces one by one, "needs purification. Disobedience is a weed. If not uprooted, it infects the Lord's garden, and God does not listen to lips swollen with pride." The air turned heavy. We all bowed our heads. No one dared move. The warning was unmistakable. Hours later, while Layla and I scrubbed the stone floor of the main corridor, she leaned toward me. Her eyes darted side to side, checking for ears in the walls. Her whisper was barely audible. They said it was because she smiled at herself in the mirror. The words hit me like a blow. Smiling at her own reflection. That was the sin that had driven Mariana into despair. From that moment, something inside me broke. The rosary at my waist, once an extension of myself, changed completely. Its touch against my body was no longer comfort. It became a discreet threat, a silent warning, whispering 3 words in my ear with every step I took. Pray, shut up, obey. I looked at the other sisters, at the way their fingers slipped methodically over the beads during communal prayers. Their lips moved in perfect rhythm, the same rhythm we had been trained to keep since childhood. Yet for the first time, I didn't just see devotion in their faces. I saw something else hiding in their eyes. Fear. The fear of losing count. The fear of letting a forbidden thought pass through the mind. The fear of being the next one chosen to receive purification. It dawned on me that the Hail Marys did not spring from the soul of most of them. They were born of obligation, born of duty, born of the desperate need to complete the quota that kept us safe. And the more I noticed this, the emptier my own chest became. The harder it became to sustain that faith which had once seemed so natural, so secure, so unquestionable. Nights became the cruelest part of life. The silence in the convent corridors was so dense that I could hear my own heart pounding like a drum of panic. Every beat seemed to echo against the stone walls. I would lie in bed, gripping the rosary between my fingers, not from conviction anymore, but from muscle memory, as if my body moved in place of my fading belief. But there was no more fervor in the prayers that left my lips. There was only repetition. It felt exactly like a schoolchild punished, forced to write the same meaningless sentence 100 times across the blackboard until her hand cramped and the words themselves dissolved into emptiness. Holy Mary, Mother of God. The phrase passed through my lips, but my mind screamed elsewhere. Questions rose like flames inside me, questions I couldn't smother no matter how hard I tried. Why would a God of infinite love require endless repetition to forgive? What kind of father needs to be convinced by groveling, as though he were some vain king starved for praise? What parent demands that a daughter beg again and again, just to listen to her heart? I knew such questions bordered on heresy, yet they felt truer, more urgent than any of the words I forced my mouth to speak. And then, what I had most feared finally came. One morning, just after the first communal prayer, one of the older sisters approached me. Her voice was toneless, detached, stripped of humanity. "Mother Susan wishes to see you." My heart sank into my stomach. A summons like that was never a sign of grace. I felt my blood run cold. Walking down the corridor toward her office was like marching toward judgment. Every step echoed in my ears, each one carrying the weight of an invisible verdict. Inside, she sat behind her heavy wooden desk, the embodiment of order, discipline, and unyielding control. She did not offer me a seat. "Sister Hameen," she said finally, her voice calm but sharpened like a blade, "there have been comments, observations. Some sisters report that you appear distracted during prayer." The words froze me. The air itself seemed to vanish from the room. "It was not my intention, Mother." I managed to murmur, my voice thin, almost lost. Then she lifted her gaze and met my eyes. They were cold, penetrating, searching for weakness. "Do you have doubts?" The question pierced me. I wanted to scream, yes. I wanted to confess that my soul was filled with doubts, that I could no longer understand why a God of mercy required so much cruelty. But terror clamped my mouth shut. My courage evaporated. I lowered my head and whispered the lie. "No, Mother, I am fine." She regarded me with a slow nod. It was not a nod of belief, only dismissal. The matter was closed, though the silence that followed was heavier than any punishment she could have ordered. Then, with deliberate calm, she extended her hand across the desk. Taking the rosary from my waist, she laid it between us on the polished wood. "This is not merely a string of beads, sister," she said, her tone low, edged like steel. "It is the reflection of your soul. If prayer breaks, faith breaks, and a broken soul is useless to the Lord." Her hand waved once in dismissal. I left the office with an emptiness that felt unbearable. The corridor seemed longer than ever, the walls higher and colder. The rosary at my side, once my refuge, now burned against me, branding me like an iron, the seal of both my failure and my imprisonment. That same night, I could not remain in my cell. I lay waiting, listening for the steady breathing of the sisters in nearby rooms, waiting for the convent to sink into slumber. Then, barefoot and silent, I slipped out into the corridor and retraced my steps toward the small oratory. The door gave the faintest creak as I pushed it open. I stepped inside, sliding into the last pew, farthest from the altar. The darkness surrounded me, deep and unbroken, and the air inside was still, colder than the corridors. I wasn't there to ask for forgiveness. I wasn't there to recite another formula. I came simply because I had nowhere else left to turn. I set the rosary across my knees, the same rosary that had been used to humiliate me hours earlier. I didn't pray. I only stared at the dark beads, at the small cross. It felt alien now, like an artifact belonging to someone else's faith. Yet I couldn't let it go. It was the key to a cell, but I hadn't found the courage to unlock the door. My thoughts drifted back to childhood. I remembered how I once believed so simply, with the innocence of a child, that God lived above the sky, listening to every whisper, every secret thought I poured out into the dark of my room. I believed he was a father, one who did not require rituals or punishments to love me. The memory cut deeply. When did we trade that father for this judge? When did love become ritual and mercy become endless repetition? The silence of the oratory gave me nothing in return. Once I would have called it sacred, now it was deaf, indifferent, an echo chamber of absence. I felt as if I were at the bottom of a well, my cries spiraling up toward a sky that had no ears. And then, from the deepest part of that well, words broke free. They were not memorized. They were not borrowed. They came from me, raw and desperate. My voice cracked, almost a whisper. "If you are there, can you see me?" That was all. One question. Nothing more. And yet, the moment those words escaped my lips, something shifted inside me. For the first time in years, fear released its grip. The constant dread that stalked me dissolved, not into joy, but into an immense hollow. And within that hollow, there was peace. It wasn't the radiant peace of triumph. It was the quiet peace of surrender. The fragile peace of someone who has nothing left to lose. I cannot tell you if that night was cold or warm. What I remember clearly is the trembling, not in my hands, which remained still, not in my voice, which had gone silent. It was in my soul, a trembling so deep it felt like the collapse of a pillar that had held me up all my life. The ground itself seemed to shift, and yet through that collapse I found I could still breathe. And in the days that followed, that strange peace, that vigilant emptiness remained. It was precisely this new inner silence that prepared me, without my realizing it, for what was about to unfold. It was a Wednesday. The lamps in the east corridor, an older, less used wing of the convent, were already dim, their yellow glow casting long shadows across the floor. That part of the building carried a reputation of its own. According to whispered rumors, it was there that private vigils or so-called spiritual corrections took place. Everyone knew what those words meant. Everyone feared them. No one could say with certainty what happened behind those closed doors, only that the sisters who were summoned there always returned different. They came back more silent, more rigid, their eyes drained of warmth. It was as though part of them had been hollowed out. That night, I had been granted permission to finish cleaning the sacristy, which required me to pass near that dreaded corridor. The convent was already heavy with its nightly silence, a silence so dense it pressed down on the skin. I expected no one. But as I turned the corner, I heard it, a sound that cut through the stillness and sent ice through my veins. A dull, muffled strike. Then another. Immediately after the second blow came a voice, cracked and trembling, pleading in the darkness. "Forgive me, Mother, forgive me." Every instinct urged me to flee, to run back to my cell, close the door, and pretend none of it existed. But my feet would not carry me away. They grew heavier, as though I were wading against an invisible current. And then the same force that had made me notice Amanda, the same pull that had driven me to whisper prayers in the oratory, pushed me forward. I needed to see. No matter how hideous, I had to know. One of the vigil room doors was ajar. The air seeping through the crack felt thick, almost poisoned. My fingertips trembled as I pushed against the wood, just enough to peer inside. What I saw etched itself into me forever. Sister Viola, barely older than a child, knelt on the stone floor. Her hands were bound in front of her, tied with her own rosary. Standing before her, motionless as an executioner carved from ice, was Mother Susan. Her expression was not anger. It was something worse, serenity, terrifying in its calmness. "Vanity is purified," she intoned, her voice steady, her tone like scripture turned into judgment. "Disobedience must be cut at the root. God does not listen to the lips of the proud." And then she raised her arm. In her hand, the crucifix of Viola's rosary dangled, the beads stretching taut. No longer a tool of prayer, it had become a whip, an instrument of correction. The rosary fell across Viola's back with a sharp crack. Once, twice, she did not scream. She only released broken moans, sounds swallowed almost before they left her lips, as though instinct itself warned her that crying out would only worsen the punishment. Each blow seemed to land on my own soul. I retreated, breathless, nausea twisting my stomach. I stumbled back through the shadows, then fled to my cell, where I collapsed onto my bed, shaking. But there was no escape. The image of the rosary, transformed into a weapon in the hand of Mother Susan, followed me. It haunted my sleep, seeping into my dreams, and when the morning bell rang, it rose with me into the new day. At dawn prayers, I knelt automatically, as if my body still knew the motions. I picked up my rosary. I tried to form the words, but the beads felt alien now, cold, heavy, tainted. I no longer saw a bridge to heaven. I saw the rope that bound Viola's hands. I saw the whip in Susan's grasp. And there, on my knees, I understood. It wasn't a ladder upward. It was a chain. That afternoon, some strange courage welled up inside me. Perhaps it was desperation. I needed to know I wasn't alone, that I wasn't mad. I searched for Sister Layla, knowing she often worked in the laundry, folding the endless piles of sheets. The laundry room was one of the few places where two people could exchange a word without immediate suspicion. My heart pounded so loudly I thought she would hear it. Waiting until the others left, I leaned close and whispered, so low my voice nearly vanished. "Layla, have you ever felt afraid of the rosary?" Her hands froze. She stared at me as though I had spoken outright blasphemy. Her eyes darted toward the door, terrified someone might have overheard. "Afraid of the rosary?" she echoed, barely shaping the words. Her lips trembled. I nodded quickly, unable to back down now. "Yes," I said, "afraid, as if it isn't a bridge to God at all, but a weight that drags us further away." Her expression shifted. Shock gave way to something more fragile: recognition. For a long moment she said nothing. She only lowered her gaze, folding the sheet with slow, careful hands. The silence between us stretched like eternity. I thought she might turn from me, or worse, denounce me. But at last, without raising her head, she murmured words so faint I almost missed them. "It touched me once too," she whispered. "But Hanin, for God's sake, don't tell anyone." The confession pierced me like a blade. It hurt, yet it brought relief. I was not alone. It wasn't only me. It wasn't just what happened to Viola. It was the system. It was the silence. From that day forward, I could no longer see my sisters the same way. When I watched one of them praying, eyes closed, lips moving quickly, I didn't feel admiration anymore. I felt a gnawing question. What had they been forced to repeat? What guilt had been tied to their beads, so that they clutched them with such desperation? The convent transformed before my eyes. It was no longer a house of prayer, but a hospital for wounded souls. Souls taught that healing meant obedience, that peace could only be born of fear. Communal prayers became unbearable. The murmur of voices, once comforting, now sounded like the chant of prisoners reciting the rules of their own captivity. That night, after speaking with Layla, an urgency seized me. I opened my hidden notebook beneath the mattress, but I didn't write a question as I had before. This time I wrote a declaration. I can no longer hold what binds me. And below the phrase, with trembling fingers, I didn't draw a cross or a heart. I drew a broken chain. In the days that followed, I began to see differently. My eyes no longer looked with blind devotion, but searched for truth. I began to notice the small details that my mind, trained to obey, had always ignored: the discreetly tear-filled eyes of a sister during the rosary, the trembling hands of a novice receiving communion, the quick excuses to hide in the pantry and cry in silence after a conversation with the Mother Superior. And I began to see God less and less in the gilded altars, and more in fleeting moments of humanity: the sigh of relief when someone broke the rhythm of prayer just to take a deep breath, the quiet tenderness hidden beneath layers of ritual. This new perception grew in me until it became a physical force. I could feel it inside my body, pulsing in my chest like a demand. It wasn't a vague thought anymore. It was a need, an urgency to act, to do something visible, something irreversible, that would prove the change happening within me. One afternoon, as a weak sun entered through the narrow window of my cell, the decision came upon me with absolute clarity. It wasn't like a sudden inspiration, but rather the inevitable conclusion of everything I had been wrestling with for months. My heart beat strangely, not with the frantic rhythm of fear, but with a solemn steadiness, as though marking a ritual of its own. And then I did it. For the first time in 17 years, since I was a terrified child brought into these walls, I reached to my waist. My fingers trembled only slightly as I untied the cord. I removed my rosary. The place on my side where it usually rested instantly felt lighter, yet strangely exposed, like skin that had always been hidden suddenly revealed to the air. I placed the rosary on the rough blanket of my bed and looked at it for a long time. There was no more confusion, no wavering thoughts. The truth was now sharp, undeniable. That object was not sacred. It was a rope, and with calm certainty, I understood I had to let it go. Forever. It wasn't a simple act. Laying it down was like cutting off a piece of myself, like severing a limb that had been there for nearly 2 decades. The absence left a mark more profound than the object ever had. In the days that followed, I kept up appearances. I attended communal prayers, moved with the same measured pace through the corridors, recited the psalms assigned for each hour. But inside, something fundamental had gone cold and silent. The words that left my lips carried no life. They were empty syllables, like scattering dried petals into the wind and expecting them to grow into a living flower. The effort of keeping this mask was exhausting. It wasn't physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of pretending, of performing a role in a drama that no longer had meaning. I felt the gaze of others on me, most of all Mother Susan's. Her eyes seemed to pierce me with quiet accusation, as though she knew the battle inside me and was waiting for me to falter. Each look pressed me deeper into the role I could no longer sustain. One afternoon, during the mandatory hour of silence, I decided to try once more. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps a final test of my heart. I knelt in my cell, folded my hands as I had been taught since childhood, closed my eyes and tried to summon the old feeling, the blind surrender. Hail Mary, full of grace, the words broke in my mouth, hollow, lifeless, not my own. Halfway through the prayer I stopped. The silence that followed was not holy, it was honest. I leaned back against the wall, feeling the cold stone press into me. For the first time, the question formed clearly, not as heresy, but as a calm reflection. If God is truly a father, does he need me to repeat 100 times a day that I love him, or does he simply want me to know him truthfully, without disguises, and without endless repetition? This question brought no fear, only a piercing clarity. From that day onward, my hidden notebook became my only true companion. I wrote more and more pages filled not with doubts about punishment, but with reflections, with new words I had never dared to imagine. Words like freedom, like listening, like breathing. They were not words of penance, but words of life. One night, unable to sleep, I crept into the small, dusty convent library. The moonlight filtered through the cracked shutters enough to see the worn spines. My hand fell on an old volume of the Gospels, a book we only ever read in fragments selected by the Mother Superior. I opened it at random. My eyes landed on a line that glowed in the pale light. "And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." I whispered it aloud. Once, twice, again and again, until the words burned themselves into me. Truth and freedom together, side by side. Not truth and punishment. Not truth and fear. It was as though a small flame had been lit in the dark cellar of my soul. The next morning, the flame became a decision. For the first time in my life, I walked to prayer without my rosary. I left it on my bed. The sensation of moving through the halls without it was both terrifying and liberating. I felt naked, as though stripped of armor, and yet lighter, freer than I had ever been. The others noticed, of course. How could they not? Their eyes flickered toward my empty waist. Their brows arched ever so slightly. No one spoke, but the silence itself grew heavier. It pressed against me like an unspoken judgment. I lowered my eyes and prayed. Not the usual recitations, but a single phrase in the quiet of my heart. "Lord, if you are still here, do not force me to lie to find you." It was during this time that Sister Layla drew closer to me. She had always been kind, but now she began to linger near, as if something invisible bound our silences together. One day, while we were tending the convent garden, she leaned toward me and whispered, "Last night, I dreamed we left through that gate at the far end." My heart skipped a beat. "And where did we go?" I asked. She smiled faintly, the saddest and most hopeful smile I had ever seen. "Nowhere. We just walked, without our habits, without fear." Her dream was a seed, small and trembling, but alive. It took root inside me. The thought of leaving ceased to be fantasy. It became possibility. Days later, returning from the kitchen, I found a piece of paper slipped beneath my cell door. No name, no signature. My hand shook as I opened it. The message inside was short, written in hurried script. "I also wonder if he listens to us." I pressed the note to my chest. I was not alone. Somewhere in these stone walls, another heart echoed mine. But the reprieve was short-lived. The very next day, Mother Susan gathered us in the refectory. Her voice was calm as ever, but beneath it was steel. She spoke of the danger of personal ideas, how pride crept in through questions, how disobedience took root when one believed her own thoughts above tradition. And though she never named me, I felt her gaze on me the entire time. It was a pressure, a silent accusation that pressed me into the ground. Yet her words had the opposite effect. Instead of frightening me back into submission, they confirmed what I had already discovered. Her God and mine were no longer the same. I found God not in the punishments, nor in the repetitions, but in the cracks where humanity leaked through. I felt him in the breeze sneaking through the high windows of the laundry room, carrying the scent of the world outside. I saw him in the quiet sobs of a novice hidden in the garden, her tears beyond the reach of ritual. Most of all, I saw him in Layla's frightened but honest eyes when silence passed between us, saying everything words could not. Faith, I began to believe, was not about having every answer or repeating every formula. It was about the courage to ask questions and to seek truth even when it hurt. And truth, I had learned, was freedom. The decision to leave was not an impulse, not a rash thought. It was a seed. It was a seed that Layla and I watered in secret for weeks with knowing glances, with whispers in the garden, with silent prayers that asked not for forgiveness but for courage. The pressure had increased so much that in an act of self-preservation to divert attention, I began wearing the rosary at my waist again. It burned against my habit, a constant reminder of my charade, but it was a necessary evil. One night, as we swept the empty corridor together, Layla stopped. Her voice was so low it was almost drowned by the distant hum of rain. "If we are going to do this," she whispered, "it has to be soon." I nodded without asking for more explanation. We both knew the schedules by heart, the footsteps of the night watch, the shadows that cloaked the hallways, the tiny interval just after the silence bell when the convent seemed suspended between wakefulness and sleep. And we knew there was only one condition that could give us a chance, a storm, fierce and heavy enough to muffle our steps and keep the sisters huddled in their cells. The waiting was its own torture. Each day we lived with our hearts lodged in our throats, pretending to be dutiful while inside we held our breath for the night of escape. And then it came. A downpour crashed against the convent with a force that rattled the windows. The wind howled around the old stone walls as though it wanted to rip them apart. It was our sign. Layla and I met in the kitchen, pretending to finish the evening chores, our hands trembling with adrenaline. Every movement was quick and deliberate, rehearsed 100 times in our minds. I reached for the keys to the garden door, which hung behind the pantry, and felt their cold weight in my sweaty palm. I slipped them inside my habit. Layla carried a small cloth bundle, a crust of bread, a candle stub, and a plain set of clothes she had hidden for years. Nothing more. We crossed the inner courtyard, running on tiptoes. The rain soaked our habits instantly, turning the cloth into heavy armor that dragged at our legs. Mud splashed up to our ankles, but we pressed on. At the garden door, I slid the key into the lock. My hands trembled so violently that I thought the metal would slip. Then click, the door opened. The sound was dry, decisive, and more liberating than any prayer I had ever uttered. We ran into the darkness, into a world we had almost forgotten. Beyond the walls, the field was nothing but mud and rain. The weight of our habits pulled us down, each step an effort against the storm. At one point, my foot sank deep into a hole. I stumbled, fell hard to my knees, and felt the sharp sting of stone under the mud. The impact snapped the rosary at my waist, its beads scattered, rolling into the muck, swallowed by darkness. Layla dropped beside me, reaching instinctively to gather them. "No," I said sharply, grabbing her wrist. The firmness in my tone startled us both. My face was wet with rain, my voice breaking from exhaustion, but I held her gaze. Leave them there." She froze, confused. Her eyes shimmered with tears and storm water. "If God wants to hear me, Layla," I declared, "He will hear me from the depths of my soul, not through wooden beads buried in the mud." For a heartbeat, silence existed between us, more powerful than the storm. In that gaze, the old Sister Hannon died forever. Together we turned away, leaving the broken rosary behind, and kept running. Hours blurred into one another as we trudged on, the rain unrelenting. By the time the black of night softened into gray, we reached an asphalt road, a dark river cutting through the land, foreign and unfamiliar. We stood there shivering, our habits torn, plastered to our skin. Two shadows stranded between one life and the next. Headlights appeared in the distance. An old truck slowed as it neared. Desperation surged in Layla. She raised her arm. The truck braked and came to a stop. The driver, a man weathered by years under the sun, leaned out. His eyes, though tired, held no judgment. He didn't question our ragged clothes or haunted faces. He simply opened the door. "Where are you going?" he asked. And without thinking, the truest words of my life left my lips. to a place where it doesn't hurt to pray. The man studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he could say. He helped us climb in. We sat in silence as the truck rumbled through the wet countryside. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the low murmur of the radio. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass and watched the world blur past. The mud on my skin dried into patches, but inside me something was melting, years of fear unraveling into tears I didn't shed aloud. When he dropped us on the outskirts of the nearest city, Lyon, we thanked him. He only raised a hand in blessing and drove away. And then we were alone. We had no money, no documents, no plan, no roof to hide under, but we had something greater. We had our names back. No longer Sister Hanin, no longer Sister Layla. Just Hanin, just Layla. That was enough. We found refuge in a small hostel run by a Christian community. They gave us bowls of hot soup and two thin mattresses on the floor, asking no questions. That night we slept a sleep so deep it felt like falling into another world. When we awoke, there were no bells, no chants, no endless repetitions, only the sound of carts in the street, of people living freely, and a silence that for once did not wound. On the steps of the hostel, Layla turned to me. Her eyes, swollen from tears and exhaustion, still shone with something new. "And now, Hanin," she asked softly, "what do we do?" For a moment I was silent, watching the busy street, the colors, the movement of ordinary life that felt so foreign and so precious. I didn't have an answer. I only knew the search was not over, only transformed. Now I whispered, "We search, but without fear." At that very moment the clouds parted. A ray of sunlight spilled across us, warming our wet skin. It felt like a blessing, simple yet absolute. And there, without the habit, without the rosary, without the formulas or the walls, I felt God in a way I had never felt before. He was in that sunlight, in the freedom of the street, in the rhythm of a world that asked nothing of me but honesty. I was free. Hanin Aguilar's journey is a reminder that true faith often lives not in repetition but in courage, the courage to question, to leave behind chains, and to seek God in freedom. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt trapped by rituals that had lost their meaning? Where do you find your spiritual connection, in rules or in freedom? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Don't leave yet. Right here beside you, a recommendation is appearing for another story about how silence can be the most powerful prayer of all. Click there and I'll see you in the next story.